Now, 26 years ago today, students and workers in China had been occupying a central square in Beijing for several weeks, angry at corruption, economic mismanagement, nepotism and the lack of career prospects. As they demonstrated peacefully and camped out in tents on the square, no one could have predicted what happened next. On the 4th of June 1989, government troops backed by tanks stormed into the square, crushing the demonstrations and mowing down anyone that stood in their way. Well, the death toll from that bloody day has never been released, but human rights groups say it could be several thousand. Across the world, disturbing images began to emerge, images that, once seen, can never be forgotten. In this special report for This Day Live, Kieran Brennan reports on a day that China is keen to forget, a day the world will always remember.
As the iconic square in the centre of Beijing, centuries of turbulent Chinese history are reflected here, stretching back to its construction during the Ming dynasty. And in modern China, where honour and tradition is central to all aspects of life, the portrait of Mao Zedong looks across to his monument to the people's heroes to the south. It is perhaps the most famous landmark in China besides the Great Wall, and serves as the focal point for military parades and ceremonies to honour visiting dignitaries, as well as a place to grieve for those killed in the course of advancing Chinese society. Following the death of the reformist General Secretary Hu Yaobang in April 1989, a man who was a colourful and iconic senior member of the Politburo and had fought for greater democratic principles, human rights and transparency of government, approximately 10,000 determined students marched on the square to demand that Hu be given full recognition for his progressive achievements and to reopen the debate on democratic reform. The Chinese government were initially hesitant, but following mass hunger strikes and copycat protests throughout the country, they resorted to vilifying the student protesters as anti-government and anti-communist agitators, and the conservative propaganda machines went into full swing, publishing demonising editorials in both print and TV media. This had the opposite effect to that intended by the Chinese authorities. The student numbers were swelled by workers, doctors and even military personnel who sympathised with their cause. On May the 20th, martial law was declared, and hundreds of thousands of troops were ordered to Beijing to stamp out the ever-growing numbers of protesters. Western journalists were banned from taking pictures, and the crackdown entered a more sinister phase when tear gas was used against the protesters. On June the 3rd, the People's Liberation Army were mobilised and headed for the square. Where they found their way blocked, they used live ammunition and armoured cars to clear a path, killing scores of unarmed people all over Beijing. News of the bloodshed reached the protesters in Tiananmen Square, some 80,000 people, and as helicopter buzzed them overhead, the square was sealed, with more killings as further demonstrators tried to join in the protests. Tanks were driven through crowds of people, and with hundreds now dead, the protesters began to retreat, many of them shot in the back as they fled. Attempts by the Chinese officials to censor international media were fruitless, as video was smuggled out and broadcast worldwide. But perhaps no single image epitomises the struggle and the bravery of the students than this series of pictures taken by Associated Press photographer Jeff Widner as the army finally took over the square. A lone man, facing almost certain death, stands in front of a row of tanks which attempts to go around him before switching off its engine. It made the front pages worldwide and is still a symbol of defiance in the face of oppression. The picture is to this day banned in China. Nobody is sure what became of the brave young man, but his courage against the odds lives on, in the hearts and minds of all who commemorate the Tiananmen Square protests and their fallen friends. In spite of government efforts to purge the episode from the history books, it is a single act of revolutionary spirit that surely even Chairman Mao himself would be envious of. Kieran Brennan, Arise News.
Now, Shia Jiang was one of the protesters on that day. He was actually arrested for his involvement in the demonstrations, and he now lives in exile in London. For the past 26 years, he's been campaigning for justice for the victims of that massacre, and he now joins me in the studio. Very good morning to you. We all have our memories of that time. What are yours? Because you were at the protests.
So because of my classmate and were killed during the night, 3rd June, when he take the video camera, just shoot the killing people in this area, Muxudi, is most of the deaths in this area, the main entrance to Tiananmen Square. And I remember whole the scene in this area because I was on the street and look the people were killed, and some people, even the doctor, try to save the people life and move the body and wounded people to tricycle or ambulance bus. They go to the street, they were killed.
So these were troops using live ammunition, firing at people, rolling tanks into the peace camps.
Yes, that's true. Because after the martial law was issued, after the 40 days, the government cannot move the army on the street. This during that time, actually Beijing autonomy rule by the people, very safe, and all the people chanting and happy for this one, because during the Communist Party regime for 40 years, people have no rights to practice exercise, rights assembling.
So this was the first time that people had been able to assemble as such, to express their thoughts and what they wanted.
Yes, they want to organize their own organization and trade union, student autonomic organization, and citizens organization, and journalist organization, artists went to street express.
Sure. I mean, you all pretty much wanted the same things that we in the West take for granted, the right to organize, the right to protest. But some people have said that apart from these things, that the movement itself was divided in some respects. Were there divisions?
So after this crackdown, the Chinese government justified its crackdown. They said they can keep the stability for develop economic, but it's totally wrong, because you must ask this question: what proposal is economic development? Is kill people is not can justify its economic development. Also, you can ask the further the question: who get what and how? Because after the develop, this all the people suffering, because it's a gap between rich and rural. It's more corruption, the people suffering polluted air, and the next generation, they lose the chance for the development.
So you would say that things have actually got worse all these years after those events in Tiananmen Square?
Yeah, that's true. You can think about every day, around 4 minutes they have protest. What happened? Most from because it's the government and local authority just push the people away from their whole house and their land. And that happened, and people go to street and demonstration. Just one protest every 3.5 minutes.
And I mean, we're talking about this quite freely and looking back at some of the events highlighted in that report, and yet you've got younger Chinese people who are not aware of what happened, or perhaps not actually interested, even if they can find out things about Tiananmen Square.
So the Chinese Communist Party regime, they control everything, especially school education. All the textbooks, they are now contents of this Tiananmen protest. They don't know what happened. Maybe some people just follow the propaganda way. The government they define this movement as this unstable society disorder. That means they ruled the mass. That the young generation don't know.
Right.
But after they suffer, they find the injustice in society, and they express it. They want to go on. More young generation, they try to cross the Great Far War and find some truth in Tiananmen.
So some things are emerging, perhaps not a great deal, but enough to perhaps raise a little bit of interest among some youngsters.
Because you can look, the young
Sure.
generation, after they graduate, they cannot find a job.
OK, Shia Jiang, I have to jump in there because sadly time goes against us, but thank you so much
Thank you.
for joining us on
Thank
the
you.
programme and taking us through those events 26 years ago today. Thank you.